Some extraordinary conspiracy theories online, including some retweeted by President Donald Trump, suggesting that people think it's rather unlikely that Jeffrey Epstein did commit suicide in prison. He had been on suicide watch. By all accounts, he should have been looked in on at least every 30 minutes, some saying even earlier than that, in a prison cell where there was no opportunity for him to commit suicide, deliberately designed to prevent suicides of this nature. What do you make of all these conspiracy theories?
Well, I mean, we've sort of crossed into a twilight zone of what's going on in American politics. It's, a house of cards like. Mayor de Blasio referred to it as way too convenient. I think Andrew Yang, one of the other Democrat political candidates, has mentioned just the obvious optics of it. I mean, to be clear, if this man is guilty of just a fraction of what he was about to go down for, he has a first-class ticket to hell. And conspiracy theories come out of these sort of repetitive circumstances of suspicious occurrences. And right now it's being used as political currency on both sides, which is, interesting to see the American left and right using it, or trying to use it. But on just pure suspicion, as you've said, Jeffrey Epstein was supposed to be on suicide watch. He had so many political heavyweights tied to him. And the ridiculous nature of it all is that if you went on the internet, a little time machine, go back 1 or 2 months and just read the amount of people writing, oh, just wait till this guy commits suicide, like jokes and jokes and jokes, which isn't a funny thing to joke about because the internet doesn't really have much of a heart for that. But just almost the prophecy fulfilled that this has occurred right now, that's just the ridiculous nature. So, I mean, it's smoke and mirrors at the time. I mean, there's so many random reports going out. We can go and look at the fact that he was supposedly barred from Mar-a-Lago, Trump's club, for incidents with guests. You can look at the fact that President Clinton, for many years before even this, crazy incident occurred, I mean, he was tied to the Lolita Express, along with plenty of other bigwigs. You look at George Clooney today having some sort of connection or association.
Well, I mean, again, the allegation is made by, in some of the court documents released, suggesting that Ghislaine Maxwell, who was described as Jeffrey Epstein's fixer, she's of course the daughter of the late Robert Maxwell, former owner of the Mirror, who'll remember him. But she apparently claimed that she had carried out a sex act on George Clooney. Again, since I think it's necessary to spell out that since a lot of these allegations do involve underage women, underage girls and prostitutes, I feel the need to say that the claim on the front page of the Sun about George Clooney doesn't involve underage, because I do think that is such a serious allegation. I think it's important to point that out. But it does seem, the left in America very keen to point out that there's this video footage of Donald Trump with Jeffrey Epstein. We know they were good friends, but then there's on the right they're very keen to point out that actually it was Bill Clinton who was a big friend with them. And there's so many conspiracy theories doing the rounds about how this plea bargain he made in 2008, where he basically pleaded guilty to soliciting a minor, an underage girl, for prostitution to avoid more serious charges, and that now these serious charges were actually coming forward. And again, so many of the court documents have emerged in the last few days as well. Some rather crucial documents are made public just hours before he is apparent suicide. People are saying it's all a little bit too convenient, but the reality is these allegations aren't going to go away because Jeffrey Epstein is dead, whether suicide or not, because a lot of these allegations are already now in the public domain.
Well, I mean, we would like to hope so. One of the things with the U.S. justice system and like in murder cases, for example, some high-profile ones that have occurred, when the defendant has committed suicide, they can't proceed on a lot of the prosecutions. Now here, let's hope that they, with all the information and research the DOJ and these agencies have put into it, that they've built a fail-safe. But I mean, he's a cornerstone witness to sort of corroborate any sort of data that might come around. So he could have provided insight to investigators that would point to both suspicions on suspect interference being tied to this suicide, because without him involved, I mean, it's really going to put a damper on what they can do and who they can charge. I mean, he was sort of the star witness. And when we speak about this man's immense wealth and privilege and the lifestyle he lived, he had, at least compared to other people, various incentives. Let's say he's facing 45 years, the man's 60. The guy at least had some incentive to perhaps make some sort of deal to get out of prison when he's 80 or something like that. Unlike a lot of people who probably could, that's a life sentence at that age. He had the means and the resources.
I mean, my understanding from those that I've spoken to in New York is that if it's a conspiracy investigation, then the U.S. Attorney's Office can still go after the various other people who may have been named, you know, in so far unreleased conspiratorial documents. And if Ghislaine Maxwell is one of those people, then she can be subpoenaed and she can be, you know, not necessarily put on trial, but certainly investigated and questioned about what she knows.
Well, she could. I mean, I think this is the next step, is that Robert Maxwell's daughter, as she is, could well be subpoenaed. Whether or not she goes to America is another matter. I mean, you know, the bottom line is that she's not a US citizen, and she doesn't have to go there and answer any of these things,
right,
if necessary. So, and there are other people that are on his payroll that are involved. I mean, this is a very, very wealthy man, and I'm sure that at the bottom of all this is not only recompense for what happened to these unfortunate girls mentally and physically, which is clearly appalling.
Yeah.
But also there will be some sort of financial recompense, which the lawyers in America, as you know, having worked there in the past, they will be going for their pound of flesh and their percentage, and they won't let it go.
Absolutely. And there's a lawyer in Miami, I think, I'm not sure if he's in Miami, but I think he's in Florida, Jack Scarola, saying there are named and unnamed co-conspirators who still need to be brought to justice. But, I mean, the problem, I suppose, for Prince Andrew, even if he manages to keep himself at arm's length here, here's a guy who was very friendly with and saw him as well. There's pictures of him, I think, walking with Jeffrey Epstein in Central Park after these charges were brought the first time around. So it's not as if he sort of dropped him as soon as he found out he was in trouble.
That's right.
They continued to see each other, didn't they?
That's right. And, of course, there is the added thing that both Maxwell and Epstein were invited to events at Windsor Castle and also to a private event at Sandringham. So, you know, it's a little bit murky. The problem you've got if you're Prince Andrew is you're being tried by association and tried by innuendo publicly, and people will be saying there's no smoke without fire and all these things. But if he has had nothing to do with, you know, in terms of what the allegations say, it must be extremely frustrating. And according to Miss Maxwell, that's, you know, what these claims that this young woman who was 17 are not true. That's what she says straight away. But, you know, the bottom line is they did work for this guy, and this guy, Epstein, clearly, you know, was involved in this appalling business. And, you know, his death just adds to the whole controversy and murkiness and seediness of the whole thing. Really.
Well, I mean, bizarrely, the conspiracy theories, I mean, as soon as I saw the story breaking over the weekend, I was like, well, this won't be long before the conspiracy theory started.
But it is strange.
Well, it's very strange. And also,
you know,
not only strange that it happened, but also strange that a week or so before, he was supposedly taken in an unresponsive condition to hospital because he had tried to kill himself. This time around, it seems that the people guarding him had somehow not given him a visual check. Somehow the cameras weren't working. I mean, really?
They should have been watching it. I mean, they should have been checking him every, you know, half an hour, 20 minutes, plus watching him on the screen. So, you know, whatever way you look at it, this is a man who, you know, a couple of weeks before tried to kill himself, knowing, you know, probably what he knows, this would probably be the way that the case might collapse and he would protect his friends, because obviously he knew an awful lot. I mean, it has all the, you know, without the political, well, it has a lot of political ramifications. I mean, we're looking at the Prince Andrew side of it, but there are a lot of major political figures and influential business people in America that were supposed to be part of his circle. And, I mean, it has all the hallmarks of, like, the Profuma affair, which also ended with one of the central characters killing himself whilst in prison. So I mean, this latest development with the suicide. I was quite shocked because, you know, after he'd tried to kill himself before, I thought, well, when I woke up to the news, I thought, well, that's referring to the previous attempt. You don't expect when someone's who's tried to kill themselves that they're not going to be allowed to be in that sort of position, you know, or given any facilities that would enable them to do it.
No, quite. And what about Prince Andrew's kind of legal situation, for example? I'm not suggesting that it will come to this, but if he was to be, say, questioned or investigated and a lawyer in the US Attorney's Office demanded that he be questioned under oath, or in some way they wanted to come here and quiz him, does he have any special protection because he's in the royal family or not?
No, he has no protection because he's in the royal family, but he certainly, these are allegations of sex with a minor and sexual abuse, of groping, and sex with a minor could be, taken to the next level because she's underage as rape, and so therefore, the problem here for him is that if he then says I'm not going to answer any questions, which I would presume is the way that his legal team would pursue it, because he doesn't have to. He is a British citizen, and unless they get a subpoena against him, unless they get an extradition order against him, there's no way he's going to be answering any questions. But it does lead to the point that, what if he had to carry out official engagements in America?
Yes.
He could end up being arrested as he arrives in, the John F. Kennedy Airport. So it is a mess, without a doubt. Whatever way you look at it, it's not a positive situation. And the very fact that he was associated with these people and the allegations against Epstein, certainly stuck enough for him to go to prison the first time round. It doesn't look good. As you say, he did continue the I won't say friendship, but relationship with Epstein, and was entertained at his New York mansion after he came out of prison. So all of these things don't look good, but equally, he's denied that he's done anything wrong, and until proven that he had done something wrong, you have to accept that is the case.
It is one of those stories, isn't it, where we're seeing the headlines and we're reading some of this more disturbing parts of this man's life. We perhaps lost sight of who the heck he is and where he came from. What do we know about Jeffrey Epstein?
Yeah. Well, he's somebody who sort of lingered in the tabloid pages, the gossip columns and such for a long time, and elements of the story have been out there. But he is someone who became sort of a high flyer in society, both in New York and in Palm Beach in Florida. After linking up, he's taught school for a while and then got into the finance business and linked up with some very, very wealthy and successful businessmen. Les Wexner, who started a company called The Limited, is probably his richest associate and client, and began managing Mr. Wexner's money, and then apparently took on managing the money of several other wealthy individuals. And in the course of that, became very, very well-to-do himself, ended up with 5 or 6 homes across the United States and in France. One of them, I think, a 100,000-acre ranch or something like that in New Mexico. And so there were all indications before his first brush with the law around 2007 or so that he was worth many hundreds of millions of dollars. And he had a couple of private airplanes, including at one point, I think, a 737 or 727, so a full-size Boeing jet. And so he was a high flyer, figuratively and literally, for a long time.
So is this a almost classic case of, guy gets lots of money, his lifestyle changes, his circle of friends changes, and suddenly his entire ego goes through the stratosphere? He suddenly realizes there are options available to him that weren't before.
I think that that's part of the story, but I think even when you're talking about very wealthy people, his perverse interest in what appears to be teenage girls, or at least people for whom there was no regard whether they were of age or not, is somewhat of an odd twist. There must be many Playboy billionaires around, but most of them don't have people
even go there,
heading to high school parking lots to try to solicit girls to come give them massages. And that's literally what was happening with Epstein. The allegations are, in these lawsuits anyway, that Ghislaine Maxwell, the daughter of the Maxwell newspaper fortune, would literally drive around Palm Beach looking for teenage girls who could be enticed for a couple $100 to come over to Epstein's house. And so that just seems, I have to say, bizarre, even for very wealthy people who are able to indulge most of their desires.
Now, this guy has already spent time in the chiller. He served, I think, 10 months of a 13 or 14-month sentence a couple of years ago. What was different this time, then, that would have led this man to take his own life? Was he facing even greater charges and therefore a longer period of time in jail?
I mean, he was, yeah. And, you know, he could have been potentially looking at the rest of his life in jail. But I think if one has to sort of psychoanalyze this, it was the total level of publicity. I mean, the whole reason this became controversial this time is because he got away with a relative slap on the wrist the last time. You know, can you Google and find the newspaper articles from him going to jail? And did they write about it in the local papers in Palm Beach and probably a couple of times in New York? Sure, they did. But it didn't become a story of national importance on network television. The president of the United States wasn't asked about it. There was not story after story about all of his associations with everyone. I mean, everybody who associated with him in his whole life basically was coming under scrutiny as to, you know, how much time did they spend with him? And would they have known that women or girls in his house were underage and that there was some impropriety going on? And this question was being asked again and again of every one of his friends. And so it just has to be about as humiliating a situation as a human could find himself in.
I'm sure. And where were the sort of investigative journalists then? Because, you know, invariably these stories, a tip-off will arrive on a desk, as you know too, Josh, from somebody. I mean, we're not talking about a fella that was hanging around with one or two rich people. We're talking about a guy here that was hanging around with some of the most powerful people on the planet.
You know, I mean, all I can say about that is that the stories were written by various people. I wrote a couple of them. There were other magazine features and so forth that brought this out. But for whatever reason, it didn't really catch fire. It may have been that at that time, names like Clinton and Trump didn't, for whatever reason, spark the public interest as much as they do today. But it's a sort of a conflagration and combination of events. Well, one thing that happened is that the man who cut that deal in Florida, the federal prosecutor, Alex Acosta, ended up becoming the labor secretary. And I have to tell you, when I heard a couple of years ago that he was being nominated as labor secretary, my jaw literally had hit the floor because I could not imagine why the Trump administration would be interested in having a discussion like the one that would surround this man. But in fact, what happened was Acosta was asked two questions about this at his confirmation hearing, and people moved on to other issues of the day. And it really didn't reemerge until there was a Miami Herald series that interviewed a lot of these women on video. That seems to have given the story life. And then federal prosecutors started looking at it again to see if, you know, maybe he had done things outside of Florida that hadn't been thoroughly investigated the first time.
So maybe not a conspiracy as such, but just one of those curious cases where the dots were not really joined together.
Yeah, and it should be said, I think it's yet to be proven that his misconduct, this sexual abuse of teenagers, continued over the past decade. That is sort of an open question. The charges that were filed against him in New York do date back to the same era of the mid-2000s. And so I have to say, I suspect that a thorough investigation would find that something untoward probably happened in the ensuing decade, but that's yet to be proven, really.
How does a man, just a final question, on suicide watch, take his own life in a prison cell?
Well, one of the questions here is whether he was really on suicide watch. I mean, there was an episode, I think, on the 23rd of July, about 2 weeks ago, where he there was found bruised in his cell. There was suspicion that it was a suicide attempt, but it wasn't totally clear. It's been reported that he told people he was attacked. He apparently went on suicide watch for about 6 days and then was taken off of it. And that's the main point under investigation at this point, which is why that happened. I can tell you that in other cases, there has been some pressure on the prison authorities not to leave people on suicide watch for a protracted period of time when there doesn't seem to be solid grounds for doing so. I'm not saying it would be appropriate to remove someone from it after just 6 days, but when people have stayed on it for too long, they start to complain. It is an unpleasant thing to be sort of surveilled and watched and woken up again over and over. So it may be that there's some institutional pressure to limit the time people spend on suicide watch, although it does seem, at least preliminarily here, that in this specific case, it wasn't handled properly.
Just in a word, Josh, are you buying the conspiracies that this guy was taken out by the system somewhere along the line because of what he knew or who he knew?
I'm not hearing anything from people that suggest to me that there was direct foul play here. I spend a lot of my time covering bureaucracies and these big government enterprises, and usually you find out some degree of neglect, incompetence, and one hand not talking to the other is a better explanation for many of these sort of tragic events than some, active conspiracy to go into the prison and off someone.